Logan had been job hunting for nearly a year, with countless interviews that went nowhere and sleepless nights spent wondering if his luck would ever change. When the offer letter finally arrived, it felt like a miracle. The company, a large firm specializing in building management systems, offered him a role as a night shift engineer, overseeing the maintenance of 3 interconnected high-rise buildings. The job required him to relocate to a new city, but they sweetened the deal with company-provided accommodation. It was a chance to start fresh, and Logan eagerly accepted. The company's provided apartment was modest but comfortable, just a short walk from the control room where he would be stationed each night. The first week of training went smoothly. Logan was paired with an experienced engineer named Mark, who showed him the ropes during the day shift. Mark was friendly, patient, and thorough, ensuring Logan understood every detail of the job. He explained how the building management system controlled everything from lighting, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning to fire safety and security systems across the 3 buildings. The control room, where Logan would spend most of his time, was a small, dimly lit space filled with screens displaying real-time data from the buildings. Logan's role seemed straightforward enough. He'd monitor the system from the control room, addressing any alarms or issues that arose. If something went wrong, like a sensor malfunction or a power surge, he'd either fix it remotely or head into the building to resolve the issue in person. It was a solitary job, but Logan didn't mind. He liked the idea of working quietly through the night, the city asleep around him. After completing his week of day shift training, Logan was ready for his first solo night shift. As he walked to the control room, the streets were eerily quiet, the city bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. The buildings loomed above him, their windows darkened except for the occasional flicker of light. Inside the control room, everything was as he remembered, calm, almost soothing in its quiet hum of machines and the soft glow of the monitors. The first few nights passed without incident. Logan grew comfortable in his routine, appreciating the solitude and the predictability of the job. But then, on the 4th night, something strange happened. It was just after midnight when an alert flashed on one of the screens. Sensor malfunction on the 13th floor of Building 3. Logan frowned at the monitor. The 13th floor was a maintenance floor, rarely used and mostly filled with storage and equipment rooms. He tried to reset the sensor remotely, but the system wasn't responding. Logan grabbed his toolkit and flashlight, trying to ignore the unease settling in his stomach. He'd been trained for this, after all. It was probably just a faulty wire or a loose connection. Still, as he exited the control room and made his way to Building 3, a chill ran down his spine. The corridors were silent, his footsteps echoing as he walked. The elevator ride felt interminable, the numbers on the display creeping upwards until it finally stopped on the 13th floor. The doors slid open with a ding, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with dust, and the fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting long, unsettling shadows. Logan stepped out of the elevator, his heartbeat quickening as he scanned the corridor. The sensor was located near the end of the hall, outside a storage room. He walked slowly, the sound of his own breathing unnervingly loud in the silence. When he reached the sensor, it looked perfectly fine, no obvious damage, nothing that should have caused it to malfunction. Logan opened his toolkit and started to inspect it, his hand steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. As he worked, a strange sensation crept over him, a feeling like he was being watched. He paused, glancing over his shoulder down the empty hallway. There was nothing there, but the feeling persisted, prickling at the back of his neck. Logan shook his head, trying to dispel the unease. He was just letting the isolation get to him. After all, he was alone in the building. He turned back to the sensor, But just as he was about to replace it, the lights above him flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the corridor into darkness. Logan's heart leaped into his throat. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. He swung it around, illuminating the hallway, the storage room door, and the elevator at the far end. Everything was as it should be, empty, quiet. But then, a sound echoed through the hall, faint but unmistakable, the creak of a door hinge. Logan's breath caught in his chest. He swung the flashlight back towards the storage room door, now slightly ajar. It had been closed when he arrived. He was sure of it. He took a step back, his mind racing. Maybe the door had just drifted open, a result of old hinges and the building's ventilation. But the rational explanation did little to calm his rising panic. He approached the door cautiously, his flashlight beam trembling as he reached out to push it open further. The door creaked louder as it swung inward, revealing a dark, cramped room filled with dusty shelves and old equipment. Logan swept the flashlight across the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room was empty, no signs of movement, nothing out of place. Logan exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. He was about to close the door when something caught his eye. A figure just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, standing motionless in the far corner of the room. Logan froze, the light trembling as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in darkness, but he could make out the faint outline of a person. His mind raced, 1,000 explanations flashing through his head. An intruder, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But before he could react, the figure moved, stepping forward into the light. It was a man, his face obscured by shadow, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. Logan's breath caught in his throat as the man took another step forward, his face finally coming into view. It was pale, almost deathly white, with hollow, sunken eyes that stared directly at Logan. A twisted, unnatural grin spread across the man's face, his lips curling into a grotesque smile. Logan stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor as he turned and bolted down the hallway. He could hear footsteps behind him, heavy and uneven, echoing in the dark. The elevator was still at the end of the hall, its doors closed. He slammed the button repeatedly, glancing over his shoulder as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The elevator doors slid open just as the figure reached the end of the hall. Logan threw himself inside, frantically pressing the button for the ground floor. The doors closed slowly, agonizingly slowly, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he saw the man's face again. Closer this time, inches from the elevator, that same twisted grin etched into his features. The doors finally shut, and the elevator lurched into motion, descending rapidly. Logan's entire body was trembling, cold sweat dripping down his face. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to calm his racing heart. It had to be a nightmare, some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But it felt so real, too real. When the elevator reached the ground floor, Logan practically fell out of it, stumbling into the lobby. It was empty, silent, the usual night shift security guard nowhere to be seen. Logan didn't care. He sprinted out of the building, gasping for breath as the cool night air hit his face. He didn't stop running until he reached the control room. Inside, everything was normal. The monitors were glowing softly, the system quietly humming along. Logan slammed the door behind him, locking it and collapsing into the chair at the desk. He stared at the monitors, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. As he sat there, trembling, a new alert flashed on one of the screens, another sensor malfunction, this time on the 13th floor of Building 2. Logan's blood ran cold. There was no way he was going back up there. No way he was going to face whatever that thing was again. He tried to reset the sensor remotely, but the system wasn't responding, just like before. Suddenly, the lights in the control room flickered, then went out, plunging him into darkness once more. Logan's breath caught in his throat as the monitors blinked off, one by one, until the room was completely dark. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Then, from somewhere behind him, he heard the soft creak of a door opening. Logan turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. The door to the control room was still locked, but the sound persisted, a low, creaking noise, like the slow opening of an old, heavy door. It was followed by footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving closer. Logan fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment everything was still. Then, without warning, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him back into darkness. Logan felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, a presence looming behind him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. Slowly, he turned his head, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. There, inches from his face, was the man again, his hollow eyes staring into Logan's, that twisted grin still etched on his face. Logan tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond, as if some unseen force was holding him in place. The man leaned closer, his cold breath brushing against Logan's ear. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. "You're not alone, Logan. You'll never be alone." Logan's vision blurred, his mind spiraling into panic. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the man's grin, stretching wider and wider, until it was all that remained. When Logan woke, he was lying on the floor of the control room, the lights flickering back on, the monitors glowing softly around him. He sat up slowly, his head pounding, his body drenched in sweat. The room was empty, no sign of the man, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the room was unnervingly quiet. Logan stood up, his legs trembling, and checked the monitors. Everything was normal, no alerts, no malfunctions, nothing to indicate anything had happened. But as he turned to leave the control room, something caught his eye, a reflection in one of the darkened monitors. He looked closer, his heart skipping a beat. There, just over his shoulder, he saw the man's face, staring back at him with that same twisted grin. Logan spun around, but the room was empty. He looked back at the monitor, nothing. Just his own pale, terrified reflection staring back at him. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. Logan stayed in the control room, too afraid to leave, too terrified to close his eyes. The following morning, Logan barely managed to drag himself out of bed. The night's events replayed in his mind over and over, a relentless loop of terror that left him exhausted and on edge. He had planned to quit the job immediately, pack his bags, and leave the city. But something pulled him back, an insistent need to confront his manager, to demand an explanation for what had happened. He needed to know if it was all in his head, or if there was something more sinister at play. Logan arrived at the office just as the day shift was starting. The building was bustling with activity, a stark contrast to the eerie emptiness of the night before. He made his way to the manager's office, his nerves frayed, his hands shaking. He knocked on the door, and a calm voice invited him in. Mr. Harris, the manager, was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a warm, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked up from his desk as Logan entered, his expression immediately softening with concern when he saw the state Logan was in. "Logan, you look like you've seen a ghost," Mr. Harris said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "What happened?" Logan hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He couldn't just blurt out that he had been chased by a spectral figure, could he? But the need for answers overpowered his reluctance. He took a deep breath and told Mr. Harris everything: how the sensor malfunctioned, the trip to the 13th floor, the man in the storage room, and the terrifying encounter in the control room. Mr. Harris listened quietly, his expression unreadable, but there was a strange stillness in his demeanor that set Logan on edge. When Logan finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. "Logan," Mr. Harris finally said, his voice calm and measured, "I understand how disturbing this must have been for you. Night shifts can play tricks on the mind. When you're alone, especially in a place as large and quiet as these buildings, it's easy to start seeing things that aren't really there." Logan stared at him, disbelief flooding his mind. "You think I imagined it?" he asked, incredulity seeping into his voice. Mr. Harris leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "I'm not saying that you didn't experience something frightening, Logan, but these kinds of things are not uncommon for night shift workers. The isolation, the darkness, it can all lead to what you described. You're not the first one to have these kinds of experiences." Logan's heart sank. "So, you knew? You knew something like this could happen?" Mr. Harris sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking more tired than before. "Yes, we've had incidents in the past. The previous night shift engineer had a similar experience. He was convinced the buildings were haunted. He left without much explanation, just like you're thinking of doing now. That's why we brought you in." A chill ran down Logan's spine. They had known, and yet they hadn't warned him. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily," Mr. Harris replied smoothly. "We believed that if you understood that it was likely just your mind playing tricks on you, you could handle it better. We were wrong, and for that, I apologize." Logan shook his head, disbelief and anger warring within him. "I'm resigning. I can't stay here, not after what happened." Mr. Harris held up a hand, his expression suddenly earnest. "Please, Logan, don't make any hasty decisions. You're a good engineer, and we don't want to lose you. I understand this has been a difficult experience, but I assure you, we'll take steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." Logan frowned, his resolve faltering. "What do you mean?" "We'll make changes," Mr. Harris said, his tone persuasive. "From now on, you won't be working the night shift alone. We're going to hire another engineer to work alongside you during the night shift. Until that person is on board, you'll work exclusively on the day shift. We'll even set a new policy. If anything happens during the night shift, the two of you will always go together. No more solo trips to the floors." Logan considered this. The idea of never having to face the darkness of those buildings alone again was tempting, and the promise of day shifts, at least for a while, was a relief. He didn't want to leave the job, he needed it, and he had worked so hard to get here. But the memory of that night still gnawed at him. "Are you sure this will help?" Logan asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Mr. Harris nodded firmly. "I'm certain. We'll make sure you're never in that situation again. Just give us a little time to bring in another engineer. I think you'll find it much easier to handle with someone else by your side." After a long moment, Logan sighed. "All right, I'll stay, but only if I'm not working nights alone." "Agreed," Mr. Harris said, a hint of relief in his voice. "Thank you, Logan. You won't regret this." For the next few days, Logan worked exclusively during the day shift. The sunlight streaming through the windows and the presence of other employees around him made it easier to forget the horrors of that night. The building felt different during the day, less oppressive, more alive. Logan's anxiety gradually began to subside, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps things would return to normal. A week later, the new night shift engineer arrived. His name was Jake, a tall, affable guy with a quick smile and an easygoing demeanor. He was a few years older than Logan, with a few more years of experience in the field, and Logan found himself warming to him quickly. They bonded over shared experiences in the industry, the challenges of the job, and their mutual love of movies. Jake had a way of making light of things, and his presence was a comfort to Logan. Jake's training began just as Logan's had, with Mark, who was still around for the day shifts, showing him the ins and outs of the building management system. Logan joined in on some of the sessions, making sure Jake understood the quirks of the night shift and sharing his own insights. The camaraderie between them helped to push the memories of that night further into the recesses of Logan's mind. When it came time for their first night shift together, Logan felt a nervous excitement rather than dread. The company's new policy meant that the two engineers would always stick together, ensuring that no one was ever left alone in the building during the night. Logan felt a sense of safety in numbers, believing that with Jake by his side, the night shift would be manageable, maybe even uneventful. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the city's lights flickered on, Logan and Jake settled into the control room, their first night shift together officially beginning. The building was quiet, as always, but with Jake's presence, the silence didn't seem as oppressive. They chatted casually, Jake cracking jokes to lighten the mood, and Logan found himself laughing for the first time in days. A few hours into the shift, an alert pinged on one of the monitors, a sensor malfunction on the 13th floor of Building 3. Logan's stomach tightened at the sight of it, memories of that night rushing back. But he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't alone this time. Jake noticed Logan's hesitation and gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "Don't worry, man. We've got this. It's probably just a loose wire or something. We'll be in and out in no time." Logan nodded, grateful for Jake's confidence. They grabbed their tools and flashlights, and together they made their way to Building 3. The elevator ride was eerily familiar, but Logan felt more at ease with Jake standing beside him, cracking jokes about horror movies and haunted houses. The elevator doors opened onto the 13th floor, the same dimly lit hallway that had haunted Logan's nightmares. But this time, it felt different. The oppressive atmosphere was still there, but with Jake's presence, it seemed less terrifying, less real. They walked down the hallway together, their footsteps echoing in unison. When they reached the malfunctioning sensor, Logan's hands were steady as he inspected it. It was a simple fix, a loose connection that was easily tightened. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Jake, who seemed completely at ease, his flashlight beam sweeping across the hallway. "You okay?" Jake asked, noticing Logan's unease. "Yeah, just this place gives me the creeps," Logan admitted. "Hey, you and me both," Jake said with a grin. "But we've got each other's back, right? No ghost is gonna mess with us." Logan smiled, feeling a little better. "Right, let's get this done and get out of here." As they finished the repair and started back towards the elevator, Logan couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before, but the memory of that twisted grin still lingered in his mind. He shook it off, reminding himself that Jake was right there with him. They were safe. The rest of the night passed without incident. They returned to the control room, where Jake immediately launched into a story about his time working in a much older, even creepier building. Logan laughed along, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. But as the night wore on, Logan couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. He told himself it was just residual fear from his previous experience, nothing more. After all, nothing had happened this time. There were no strange figures, no sudden power outages, no unexplained noises. Everything was fine. But deep down, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, biding its time. As the first light of dawn began to break through the horizon, Logan and Jake completed their shift, handing over to the day crew with the usual briefings. Logan felt a sense of accomplishment, even relief. The night had passed without any real incidents, and he and Jake had worked well together. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind him. But as they left the building and stepped into the early morning light, Logan couldn't resist one last glance back at the towering structure behind them. For just a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move behind one of the upper floor windows, just a flicker, gone in an instant. He blinked and it was gone, leaving him wondering if he had imagined it. Jake noticed him staring and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, man, let's get some breakfast. You've earned it." Logan nodded, tearing his eyes away from the building and forcing a smile. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked away, Logan couldn't help but feel that the night shift wasn't done with him yet, that whatever haunted the shadows of those buildings was still there, waiting. But with Jake by his side, he felt a little more prepared to face whatever might come next. The unease that had plagued Logan during his night shifts never fully disappeared, but with Jake by his side, he managed to push it to the back of his mind. They had settled into a rhythm, working through the nights together, sharing stories and keeping each other company. The new policy of sticking together had worked well so far. But in the back of Logan's mind, the memory of that night on the 13th floor lingered like a shadow, never fully fading. One particularly quiet night, an alert pinged on the control room monitors. It was a sensor malfunction, again on the 13th floor of Building 3. Logan's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the screen. Jake noticed his reaction and nudged him with a reassuring smile. "Come on, man, we've done this before. It's just another sensor," Jake said, his tone light, though Logan could sense the tension in his voice. They grabbed their tools and flashlights, making their way to the elevator. The ride-up was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound. When they reached the 13th floor, the doors slid open to reveal the same dimly lit hallway that had haunted Logan's nightmares. They stepped out, their footsteps echoing ominously as they walked down the hallway toward the faulty sensor. As they reached the sensor, Logan set to work immediately, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. He focused on the task, his hands moving methodically as he tightened connections and checked readings. Just as he was about to finish, Jake suddenly turned to him. "Hey, I need to hit the restroom real quick. You good here?" Jake asked, pointing down the hall. Logan looked up, a flash of panic in his eyes. "Jake, can't you wait? I'm almost done. Let's just finish this and get out of here." Jake chuckled, trying to downplay the tension. "Come on, Logan. Don't tell me you're still scared. I'll be right back, just on the same floor. I won't be long." Logan hesitated but finally nodded, watching as Jake walked down the hallway toward the restroom. The door creaked open, and Jake disappeared inside, leaving Logan alone. The hallway seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening as Logan returned to his work. He tried to focus on the sensor, but his mind kept drifting to the silence around him, the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on him. Inside the restroom, Jake quickly finished up in one of the stalls, feeling a slight chill in the air. He dismissed it as nerves, chuckling to himself as he stepped out and moved to the sink to wash his hands. As he turned on the tap, he heard the door to the restroom creak shut behind him. He glanced up at the mirror, expecting to see Logan trying to sneak up on him, but the room was empty. "Nice try, Logan," Jake called out with a grin, still washing his hands. "You think you can scare me like that? Not gonna happen." The lights flickered suddenly, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead. Jake frowned, glancing at the mirror again. This time, he saw something, a shadow moving behind him, just out of the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but the restroom was empty. Just as he was about to dismiss it as his imagination, all the faucets in the restroom suddenly burst to life, water gushing from every tap, filling the room with a cacophony of rushing water. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights flickered again, more violently this time, and in the mirror he saw him, the same man Logan had described. The figure stood behind Jake, his twisted grin wide, eyes hollow and dark, staring right at him through the mirror. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and before he could react, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. A long time passed, too long. Logan had finished replacing the sensor and was waiting anxiously in the hallway. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Logan paced back and forth, his anxiety growing with every passing second. Finally, unable to take it any longer, he decided to go check on Jake. Logan's footsteps echoed ominously as he approached the restroom. He pushed open the door, the sound of dripping water greeting him. Inside, the restroom was dark, save for the dim emergency light above the sink. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive silence. "Jake?" Logan called out, his voice trembling slightly. He took a step inside and froze. There, lying on the cold, wet floor, was Jake, unconscious. Panic surged through Logan as he rushed to Jake's side, kneeling down and shaking him gently. "Jake! Jake, wake up!" Logan whispered urgently. Jake stirred, his eyes fluttering open as Logan sprinkled water on his face. He blinked, disoriented, his face pale. When he finally focused on Logan, his eyes were wide with terror. "Logan, get me out of here," Jake gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan didn't need to be told twice. He helped Jake to his feet, supporting him as they hurried out of the restroom and back down the hallway. The elevator ride back to the control room was a blur, both of them breathing heavily, hearts racing. Once they were back in the relative safety of the control room, Jake slumped into a chair, his hands shaking as he recounted what had happened. He described the faucets turning on by themselves, the lights flickering, and the man in the mirror, the same man Logan had seen that night. Logan listened in stunned silence, his worst fears confirmed. They were not imagining things. Something truly malevolent was lurking in that building, specifically on the 13th floor. They spent the rest of the night in the control room, too terrified to leave. The monitors glowed softly around them, providing a faint sense of security, but neither of them could shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. They stayed awake, vigilant, until the first light of dawn signaled the end of their shift. The next morning, exhausted but determined, Logan and Jake marched into Mr. Harris's office. They recounted the night's events in detail, their voices laced with fear and frustration. Mr. Harris listened intently, his expression growing more serious as they described the incidents on the 13th floor. When they finished, Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "You mentioned that all these incidents happened on the 13th floor." Logan and Jake nodded, both of them too drained to speak further. Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed as he considered this. "That's interesting. The previous night shift engineer, the one before Logan, also had his encounter on the 13th floor. And then there's your experience, Logan, and now this. It seems to be centered around that floor." Jake spoke up, his voice firm despite the fear still gnawing at him. "Mr. Harris, we can't keep working here if this keeps happening. We're done. We want to resign." Logan nodded in agreement, too shaken to protest. Mr. Harris held up a hand, his expression earnest. "I understand your fear, and I don't want to put either of you in harm's way. But if this is indeed centered around the 13th floor, then perhaps there's something we can do. I propose this. We'll seal off the 13th floors in all 3 buildings, completely. We'll remove the buttons from the elevators, cut the power, and lock the access doors. The 13th floor will no longer exist for all intents and purposes." Logan and Jake exchanged glances, uncertain. Mr. Harris continued, his tone sincere. "If anything happens after that, if you still feel unsafe, I won't stop you from resigning. But give me one last chance to make this right." After a long, tense pause, Logan finally nodded. "All right, but if anything else happens, we're gone." Jake agreed, though the hesitation was clear in his voice. One last try. True to his word, the company moved quickly. The 13th floors were sealed off entirely. The elevator buttons for the 13th floor were removed. The lifts were programmed to skip the floor altogether. Access doors to the 13th floors were locked and bolted, and the power was cut, plunging those floors into darkness. It was as if the 13th floor had been erased from existence. After the floors were sealed, things seemed to settle down. Logan and Jake returned to their night shifts, and for a while, it seemed like the nightmare was finally over. The building was quieter, less oppressive, and they began to relax into their routine once more. But every so often, as they walked through the buildings on their rounds, a sense of unease would creep in. Sometimes, when they were fixing sensors on other floors, they would catch a glimpse of something, a fleeting shadow moving behind a window on the 13th floor, or a flicker of movement out of the corner of their eye. It was always subtle, always distant, and it never seemed to be a threat. Whatever haunted the 13th floor seemed to be contained, its influence waning now that the floor was sealed off. The incidents that had once terrorized them never happened again. Logan and Jake continued their work, but the shadows of the 13th floor lingered in their minds, a reminder of the darkness that still lurked just beyond reach. And though they never spoke of it, both men knew that the floor's darkness had never truly left them. It was just waiting, biding its time, hidden away in the sealed-off spaces of the building, a secret known only to those who had survived its horrors. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to Vulnerable Screams for more spine-chilling content. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and always remember, the shadows are closer than you think, and they're always watching.